Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. And tonight we are telling a story that is 100% real. Every name is real, every company is real, every cover-up is documented in federal records, congressional testimony, and court filings, and it is a story that should have been on the front page of every newspaper in America and was not. A story about 300 million gallons of poison rolling through the mountains of eastern Kentucky like black lava. About a federal investigator who found the evidence that could have sent executives to prison and who refused to stay quiet. About the machinery of the most powerful government on earth being turned against one man because he would not sign his name to a lie. And about what it costs a human being to tell the truth when the people who want you to stay silent have essentially unlimited resources and no conscience. So settle in, because this one is going to stay with you. The story begins in the hollows of Martin County, Kentucky, a place tucked into the eastern edge of the state, right along the West Virginia border, a place of extraordinary natural beauty and extraordinary poverty. A place where generations of families had worked the coal seams and where the coal industry had shaped everything about daily life. The roads, the schools, the economy, the water. Always the water. Because water in the coal country of eastern Kentucky runs through the same landscape that coal runs through, the same ridgelines and hollows and creek beds. And when you put those two things together, the water and the coal industry's waste, what you get is a problem that the companies and the regulators who were supposed to oversee them had been managing for decades, not by solving it, but by hoping it would not become catastrophic on anyone's watch. And in the early morning hours of October 11, 2000, that hope ran out. Because sometime after midnight, the bottom of a 72-acre coal slurry impoundment owned by a company called Martin County Coal Corporation, which was a subsidiary of the giant Massey Energy, gave way, and approximately 306 million gallons of thick, black coal slurry, a toxic soup of arsenic, mercury, lead, and other heavy metals, poured through the collapsed bottom into a network of abandoned underground mine shafts below and came roaring out into Wolf Creek and Coldwater Fork, two tributaries of the Tug Fork River. And what happened next was the kind of thing that people who witnessed it have spent years trying to find words for. The creeks turned black, not brown, not gray, but black. A slow-moving tide of thick sludge that crept across the landscape and covered everything it touched. It poured into residential yards, it flooded properties, it killed every fish, every crawdad, every water insect, every living thing in 100 miles of waterways in a matter of hours. And by morning, more than 27,000 people in Martin County and surrounding communities had their drinking water contaminated, and the sludge was still moving, heading toward the Big Sandy River, heading toward the Ohio River, moving slowly and unstoppably through the waterways of eastern Kentucky and West Virginia like a disease. And it was 30 times larger by volume than the Exxon Valdez oil spill. 30 times. And most Americans have never heard of it. And the reason most Americans have never heard of it is a story unto itself that we will get to.
First, you need to understand the man who tried to make sure the full truth came out and what happened to him when he did. His name is Jack Spadaro, and he is one of the most important and least celebrated figures in the history of American environmental law. Spadaro was a mining engineer who had spent his entire professional career working in mine safety. He had been on site at the Buffalo Creek disaster in West Virginia in 1972 when a coal slurry dam failed and killed 125 people. That disaster had formed him, had given him a clear and permanent understanding of what coal slurry impoundments could do when they failed, and of what the human cost of institutional negligence looked like when it came due. He had spent decades working for the Mine Safety and Health Administration, known as MSHA, which is the federal agency responsible for overseeing safety in American mines. He had become an expert on slurry impoundment failures specifically, and in the fall of 2000, he was the superintendent of MSHA's National Mine Health and Safety Academy in Beckley, West Virginia, when the Martin County spill happened, and he was assigned to be part of the federal team investigating it. And what he and his team found as they dug into the evidence was not simply a catastrophic accident. What they found was something considerably more deliberate and considerably more damning. They found that there had been a previous spill at the same Martin County coal impoundment in May of 1994, 6 years before the disaster, a spill of 100 million gallons that had also broken through into abandoned mine workings below. And after that 1994 spill, an MSHA engineer named Larry Wilson had written a memorandum making 9 specific safety recommendations that Martin County Coal and the MSHA district office needed to implement before the company could continue using the impoundment. Recommendations that, if followed, would have identified the structural vulnerability that eventually caused the catastrophic 2000 failure. And what Spadaro and his team discovered was that those 9 recommendations had been largely ignored, that MSHA had not enforced them, that Martin County Coal had not only failed to implement them, but had continued adding slurry to the impoundment in the years between 1994 and 2000, raising its level and increasing the pressure on the already compromised bottom, and that the company had submitted engineering drawings to regulators that misrepresented the underground conditions beneath the impoundment. And by late 2000, the investigation team had gathered enough evidence to support citations for willful and criminal negligence against Massey Energy and potentially criminal liability charges against individual executives. It was a significant and potentially historic finding. It was the kind of investigation result that the federal regulatory system is supposed to be capable of producing. It was exactly what Jack Spadaro had spent his career working toward. And then, on January 20th, 2001, George W. Bush was inaugurated as President of the United States, and within days, everything changed. A new team leader was installed to run the Martin County investigation, a man named Tim Thompson, who, according to Spadaro and other team members who spoke on condition of anonymity, began systematically narrowing the scope of the investigation, began removing sections of the draft report, specifically the sections referencing the 1994 recommendations and the pattern of MSHA's failure to enforce them, began dropping witnesses, began taking the question of MSHA's own culpability entirely off the table. And Spadaro watched this happening, and he understood what he was watching. He understood that the investigation was being shaped not by what the evidence showed, but by what the incoming administration needed the evidence not to show. And the reasons for that shaping were not obscure. Massey Energy CEO was a man named Don Blankenship, who was one of the most powerful figures in Appalachian coal and who had extensive connections to Republican politics. And during the time of the investigation, Blankenship had met multiple times privately with Dave Lauriski, the Bush administration's newly appointed head of MSHA, who had himself spent 30 years as an executive in the mining industry before taking the regulatory job. And in September of 2002, Massey Energy's Political Action Committee gave $100,000 to the National Republican Senatorial Committee, a committee that had previously been chaired by Senator Mitch McConnell of Kentucky, who was also the husband of Elaine Chao, who was the Bush administration's Secretary of Labor, who was the cabinet official who oversaw the Mine Safety and Health Administration, the agency that was supposed to be holding Massey Energy accountable. And you have to sit with that constellation of relationships for a moment, because it tells you everything you need to know about why the investigation went the direction it went. When MSHA released its final accident investigation report in October 2002, it cited Martin County Coal for 2 minor violations with fines totaling $110,000, the legal maximum in civil penalties, and 0 criminal charges. The 8 to 10 serious violations that the original investigation team had recommended were reduced to 2.
The 1994 recommendations and MSHA's failure to enforce them were largely absent from the final report, and the question of willful and criminal negligence that the evidence had supported was simply gone. Spadaro had resigned from the investigation team in April of 2001 after refusing to sign off on what he believed was a falsified report. He filed a complaint with the Department of Labor's Office of the Inspector General, alleging that Bush administration officials were obstructing the investigation, and he began speaking publicly about what had happened. And the retaliation was not long in coming. On June 4, 2003, government agents entered Spadaro's office at the National Mine Health and Safety Academy and went through his files while he watched. He was locked out of his office and placed on involuntary administrative leave. His superiors charged him with a series of violations, including abusing his authority, misusing government credit cards, and failing to follow instructions. Spadaro denied every charge and filed a lawsuit against the government. A Democratic congressman named Nick Rahal said publicly that Spadaro's status as a whistleblower raised very serious concerns about the nature of the disciplinary investigation being mounted against him. And eventually, through legal proceedings, Spadaro was reinstated to his position but then placed on administrative leave again and ultimately demoted, and he eventually resigned. The man who had spent 35 years dedicated to the safety of miners and the communities around mines, who had refused to falsify a federal investigation report when instructed to do so, who had tried to make sure that the people responsible for one of the worst environmental disasters in American history were held accountable, was forced out of the government he had served for his entire professional life. And Massey Energy paid its fine and continued operating, and Don Blankenship continued running Massey Energy, and the people of Martin County continued living with the consequences of the disaster, the contaminated waterways, the health concerns, the ongoing water quality problems that would persist and in many ways worsen for decades. And I want you to hold that timeline for a moment, because here is what it looks like laid flat. In 1994, 100 million gallons of coal slurry broke through the bottom of the Martin County impoundment. An MSHA engineer wrote 9 recommendations to prevent it from happening again. Those recommendations were ignored. In 2000, 300 million gallons broke through the same bottom and contaminated the water supply of 27,000 people and killed every living thing in 100 miles of waterways. A federal investigation found evidence of willful and criminal negligence and was preparing to recommend charges. A new political administration came to power with deep financial ties to the company responsible. The investigation was gutted. The company was fined $110,000 and faced no criminal charges. The whistleblower who refused to sign the falsified report was forced out of his job, and the people of Martin County Hollows, where the water still does not run clean, went on drinking their water and wondering about the rashes and the illness and the colors in the creek. And then in 2006, Don Blankenship and 29 miners at his Upper Big Branch mine in West Virginia were killed in a methane gas explosion that investigators would later determine resulted from the same culture of deliberate safety violations that had characterized Massey Energy's operations for years. And Blankenship would eventually be convicted in 2015, not of 29 counts of murder, but of a single misdemeanor, conspiring to willfully violate mine safety standards, and he served 1 year in federal prison. 1 year for the deaths of 29 men and for 300 million gallons of poison in the water supply of 27,000 people. And the Martin County water crisis did not end with the cleanup. As recently as 2018, University of Kentucky researchers found that 47% of household water samples in Martin County contained at least one contaminant exceeding federal standards, and the county water bill sent to residents included printed warnings that the water could increase the risk of cancer and cause liver, kidney, and central nervous system damage. And residents were simultaneously facing a proposed 50% rate increase for that water, that contaminated cancer risk water. Jack Spadaro is still alive. He went on to become an independent mine safety consultant and expert witness, and he has continued to speak about what happened in Martin County and about the broader systemic failures in American mine regulation that made it possible.
He received the Genco Foundation Award for his commitment to the Appalachian region. He was honored by advocacy organizations and by the communities whose safety he had spent his career trying to protect. But he never got the investigation he refused to falsify, and the people who pressured him to falsify it faced no accountability. The Department of Labor Inspector General report that was supposed to examine the political interference allegations was released with large sections blacked out and was widely described as raising more questions than it answered. And the full truth of what happened in the Martin County investigation and who gave which orders and what exactly was communicated between Don Blankenship and Dave Lauriski in those private meetings has never been fully and publicly established because the government that was supposed to establish it was the same government that was doing the covering up. And that is the story, the whole, terrible, real, documented story. The 300 million gallons of poison, the 27,000 people who lost their clean water, the federal engineer who spent 3 decades doing his job with integrity and was fired for it, the company whose CEO met privately with the regulator while his PAC donated $100,000 to the committee chaired by the regulator's boss's husband, the fine that worked out to roughly $4 per person whose water was contaminated, the misdemeanor conviction for 29 dead miners, and the Martin County hollows where the water still does not run clean. Remember Jack Spadaro, remember Martin County, and understand that the difference between a crime and a policy decision is often nothing more than who is in power when the evidence gets reviewed.